Their plan to exclude me from the family vacation backfired in the worst way. It began, like most betrayals, not with a dramatic confrontation or some cinematic scream of truth, but with silence, strategically sculpted, brittle, and heavy with omission. I had always known I was a footnote in my own family, the unnecessary end credit scene after the main feature. But there's a strange kind of pain that settles when they stop even pretending otherwise. It wasn't just the missing text messages or the lack of returned calls that tipped me off. It was the orchestrated effort, intentional, meticulous, that told me they hadn't simply forgotten me. No, this was exclusion wrapped in gift paper and tied with a bow of cruelty. It started with a photo, a casual, careless post that slipped past whatever veil of secrecy they had constructed. My older sister, Celine, the perennial golden child, had tagged the location. Four Seasons Resort, Bora Bora. And beneath the picture of white sands and turquoise oceans, the entire family smiled. Mom, still clinging to the glamour of her younger years with oversized sunglasses and a permanent glass of Sauvignon Blanc. Dad, hiding his discomfort behind a strained grin, likely aware on some level that something had gone too far but unwilling to upset the ecosystem of favoritism. Then there were the twins, Max and Sophie, forever attached at the hip, their lives a carousel of privilege and self-congratulation. And there, nestled between my cousins and Celine, was Grandma, the matriarch, the orchestrator, the woman who could raise hell with a look and had, many times, reduced me to a whisper in my own home. Her inclusion hurt the most, because if even she had signed off on this, then there was no one left pretending I mattered. The caption read, "Family time. Nothing better than being together in paradise. Blessed family first. Family first." Except apparently when it came to me. I didn't cry. There was no dramatic breakdown, no crumpling to the floor in a heap of devastation. I simply stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the image like if I pressed hard enough, I could teleport through it and ask, why wasn't I enough? But I already knew the answer. I wasn't beautiful like Celine. I wasn't effortlessly charming like the twins. I didn't play the role well. I didn't fit in the mold they'd cast for what a right should be. They hadn't even bothered to delete our group chat. That was the insult's cherry on top. It still sat there, empty of messages for weeks, even as I scrolled back and watched the shift in language, the gradual exclusion, the careful curation of words. They stopped mentioning plans, using vague phrases like, just hanging out, or nothing big. They told me everyone was too busy this summer for anything major. A well-coordinated lie delivered in fragments. That's how they did it. Death by 1,000 omissions. But the universe, whether cruelly ironic or secretly benevolent, doesn't always play along with scripts written by people who think they're untouchable. I wouldn't call what happened next karma, exactly. Karma implies some kind of cosmic justice, an inevitable reckoning. This wasn't fate correcting an imbalance. This was me, finally handed the pen to write my own version of the story. And I did so without flourish, without vengeance masquerading as virtue. I simply stepped into the opportunity they'd never see coming. It started with a letter, one thick ivory envelope bearing the name of my great-aunt Margaret, a woman who had loomed over the family history like a shadowed rumor. She was the estranged sister of my grandmother, the black sheep who moved to Europe in her 20s and never returned, save for a family event card here or a cryptic gift there. I had met her only once, at age 11, when she visited and spent more time talking to me than anyone else. I barely remembered the conversation, only that she asked what I liked to read and then handed me a first edition of Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, whispering, "This world will want to silence you. Make sure you learn to speak anyway." The envelope contained a letter and a deed. Margaret had died, quietly, alone, and apparently very wealthy. And she left everything to me. The villa in Florence, the antique bookstore tucked away in a quiet Roman alley, the trust fund with an obscene number of zeros. Mine. No strings, no warnings. Just a final note scrawled in sharp black ink. "You were the only one who saw me, now let them see you." I didn't tell anyone, not immediately. Let them have their sunsets and their mimosas and their fake laughter on white sand. I didn't need to crash their vacation to make a point. I needed only to exist beyond them, to thrive in a way they couldn't ignore. So I started small, posting photos, subtle but deliberate. A snapshot of the view from my new apartment overlooking the Arno, a book launch party invite from a prestigious European publisher. My words, my voice, finally published. A dinner with names they recognized, writers and critics they followed on Twitter. And then, just when the timing was precise, surgical even, I flew back. Not to my parents' house, of course. I had long since stopped thinking of it as home, but to a mutual cousin's engagement party, a family affair, one they hadn't bothered to warn me about, assuming I wouldn't come. I wore black, not out of mourning, but because nothing says you underestimated me quite like elegance dipped in defiance. The reactions ranged from theatrical surprise to subtle unease. Celine blinked like she'd seen a ghost. Grandma's smile tightened by a millimeter. The twins whispered behind champagne flutes, calculating. Only my father had the decency to look sheepish, like maybe some part of him regretted the cowardice of silence. "Darling," Celine cooed, always a snake under silk. "We didn't know you were back in the country." "Apparently," I replied, lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "There's a lot you didn't know." I didn't have to announce anything. The whispers did it for me. People asking what I'd been up to, commenting on the photos, mentioning Margaret's name. It spread like perfume in a closed room, undeniable, inescapable. The overlooked one, the afterthought, had become the centerpiece, the conversation. What made it exquisite wasn't their envy. It was their confusion. They had tried to erase me from the narrative, but I'd rewritten the story entirely. Not as a cautionary tale, not as a martyr, but as something else. An interruption in their curated timeline. Celine pulled me aside before the speeches began. She always had to control the narrative, wrap things in plausible deniability. "We didn't mean to exclude you," she said, voice honeyed but strained. "It just kind of happened. You're always so distant, you know?" I looked at her, really looked, and saw the cracks beneath the polish. The lines in her forehead she pretended didn't exist, the flicker of insecurity masked by expensive concealer. "No," I replied, voice calm, unshakable. "You meant it. You just didn't think I'd notice, or that I'd matter enough to care. There was no scream, no slap, no scene. Just silence. That same silence they had once weaponized now turned on them. Because they couldn't unsee me now. They couldn't pretend I was peripheral. I had become the disruption, the glitch in their seamless family photo. And this was only the beginning. The night of the engagement party left behind a silvery aftertaste, something between triumph and unease, like the buzz of champagne after too many sips. I had walked out of that hall with my head high, my dress catching the city lights like fireflies, and my silence louder than any retort could have ever been. They hadn't expected me to show up, let alone appear transformed, impossible to ignore. But what they still didn't understand, couldn't begin to comprehend, was that this wasn't about revenge. Not really. It wasn't about proving a point or flaunting newfound wealth. It was about occupying the space they'd tried to erase me from, permanently, without apology. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, but behind the stillness, the winds began to stir. It began with the calls. Celine was first. She left a voicemail, then another. The third message was a carefully calculated mixture of concern and condescension. "We should talk. It's been too long, and I think we just misunderstood each other." Misunderstood. A word so hollow it echoed when she spoke it. I didn't return the call. Not yet. Let her sit with the silence. Let her feel the absence of a response. Let it gnaw at the edges of her certainty. Next came the twins. Max sent a DM on Instagram, casual, as if we were still teenagers sneaking drinks at family barbecues. "Yo, sick apartment. When did you move to Florence?" As if he hadn't seen the photos. As if the entire family group chat wasn't lit up now with speculation, piecing together the timeline like amateur detectives fumbling through a mystery none of them had been invited to solve. Sophie followed a day later with a more sincere attempt. "I didn't know you were that close to Aunt Margaret. No one did. She never even mentioned it." That was the point, of course. Margaret had understood exactly what this family was. She had kept her distance not out of bitterness but preservation. And in that single afternoon all those years ago, she had recognized something in me that no one else had taken the time to see. Maybe it was the way I watched the room more than I spoke in it, or the fact that I asked questions instead of performing answers. Whatever it was, it had mattered enough to her to rewrite her will. My mother's call came at midnight, not unexpected. She always called when she didn't want to be held accountable for what she said, like the dark could absolve her. Her voice was soft, the way it got when she was playing the long game. "We should have told you about the trip," she began, not even trying to pretend it wasn't deliberate. "It was complicated. There were too many people. You know how your cousins get, and things have been tense lately. We didn't want to add more stress." I leaned back on the balcony of my Florence apartment, the night air brushing my skin like silk, and let her speak. Let her twist reality into something palatable to her tongue. "You could have told me," I said eventually, my tone flat but precise. "You all had time to build a group chat without me. That doesn't happen by accident." A pause. "You've always been independent." Another rebranding of the truth. I had been alone, marginalized, pushed to the periphery until I learned how to survive on my own. "You didn't invite me because you didn't want me there," I said, the words as crisp as they were final. "Let's not insult both of us by pretending otherwise." She didn't answer. Not really. Just a quiet sigh, like I had somehow disappointed her by calling her bluff. We hung up not long after. No apologies, no clarity. Just silence once more, this time cracked down the middle. The first true fracture came not from me, but from within their carefully curated harmony. 2 weeks after the party, I received a message from Natalie, my cousin on my father's side, and perhaps the only person in the family who had ever extended kindness without strings. She wasn't in the Bora Bora photos I'd noticed, hadn't posted, hadn't commented. Her message was short, but laced with urgency. "Have you seen what Celine posted? Check her story. Now." My thumb hovered again, the way it had that first night. I clicked. It was a video, one clearly not meant for public consumption. Someone had uploaded it by mistake or out of malice, I couldn't tell. It showed Celine in the midst of a hotel suite argument, the kind that didn't begin with yelling but with icy whispers that cut deeper than shouts ever could. The camera was off-kilter, likely held under the table, but the audio was clear. "I don't care what she inherited," Celine hissed to someone off-camera. Probably Sophie, judging by the blur of blonde hair in the mirror's edge. "She doesn't belong in this family. She never did. Just because some bitter old woman gave her a few million doesn't mean we start pretending she matters." My stomach didn't drop. There was no sting of betrayal left. Just confirmation. Like the final piece of a puzzle snapping into place. They hadn't changed. They hadn't learned. The facade cracked because it had always been just that. Paint over rotting wood. The video went viral in our social circles. Someone had leaked it to a cousin who sent it to another, and soon it was echoing through our extended family like a gunshot in a cathedral. My inbox lit up again. Some messages were apologetic, others furious. Sophie's was long, defensive, insisting she hadn't known Celine was being filmed, that she didn't mean any of it. But the most unexpected message came from Grandma. Subject: "We need to talk." I stared at the email for a long time. The last time she had reached out to me directly was 2 years ago, and that was just a forwarded article about the dangers of radical feminism, with no explanation. Now, suddenly, she wanted a conversation. I didn't delete it. I didn't answer either. I just let it sit, like a stain on white silk. But fate, as it does, delivered the conversation anyway. I ran into her, inevitably, at the reading of Margaret's will. The formal one. The ceremony where lawyers in bespoke suits and relatives in designer grief gathered to hear the final confirmations of what everyone already suspected. I hadn't planned to attend, but part of me, the part that still sought something resembling closure, needed to see it through. She sat in the front row, her black veil a theatrical touch. Celine sat beside her, unusually silent, her phone clutched like a lifeline she couldn't use. The rest of the family flanked the room like pillars in an ancient ruin, decorative, cracking, but still pretending to hold weight. When my name was read aloud again and again, tied to properties, investments, letters, and art collections, I didn't flinch. I watched their expressions shift. Some were blank, others confused. But the worst ones were calculating, already thinking about how to spin this, how to realign themselves with me now that Margaret's choices had upset the hierarchy. After the reading, Grandma approached. She didn't hug me. She never had. But she placed a gloved hand on my arm and said, "You always were Margaret's favorite." It wasn't a compliment. It was an accusation dressed as nostalgia. "She saw something in me," I replied. "Something the rest of you were too busy ignoring." She tightened her grip, her face still, voice low. "Be careful. Money changes people. It makes them believe they're owed something." I smiled then, not sweetly, but the kind of smile one wears when they know they're being threatened, but are no longer afraid. "Funny. That's exactly what she said about you in her letters." Her hand dropped away. There would be no reconciliation, no teary apologies or familial healing. What existed between us was older than Margaret's will, older than the Bora Bora betrayal. It was systemic, a family disease passed down in glances, in omissions, in orchestrated exclusions. What they hadn't counted on was my evolution. Weeks passed. My name began to appear in places they couldn't ignore. A featured essay in The Atlantic, an invitation to speak at a university symposium, an interview on a podcast where I talked about the architecture of neglect, how being unseen can either crush you or shape you into something unbreakable. They listened. I knew they did. The next family event was unavoidable. My cousin Olivia's wedding. Everyone would be there, even extended family from Montreal and Lisbon. I almost didn't go, but then I remembered something Margaret once wrote in the margins of a letter. Sometimes the only way to be heard is to stand precisely where they told you not to. So I attended. I wore red, a dress that moved like flame, sharp-angled and unapologetic. The whispers began the moment I entered. I didn't smile at anyone, not at first. I didn't make small talk or ask about careers or children. I let them come to me. And they did, one by one, polite, curious, envious, rehearsing their lines like actors unsure if the script had changed. Eventually, Celine approached. She waited until the music had softened and the dance floor emptied. She wore silver, her hair in a flawless twist, but her eyes were tired, her mouth tight. She looked like a woman who had lost the mirror she used to measure herself against. "I messed up," she said, no preamble. I let it get out of hand. "You mean the video?" She winced. I didn't know Sophie was recording. I was venting. I was angry. Jealous, maybe. Maybe? Her hands tightened around her clutch. "You made us all look bad." "I didn't make you say anything, Celine. I just stopped hiding what you all chose to ignore." She nodded slowly. "So what now? You write us all off? You get to be above it?" "No," I said, tilting my head. "I just get to not need your approval anymore. That's the difference." She said nothing. Just walked away, shoulders pulled taut like a marionette with fraying strings. The night ended with fireworks, lavish, unnecessary bursts of color lighting up the sky. Everyone watched. I didn't. I turned away, stepping back into the car waiting for me. There would be more cracks, more fractures, more family events filled with strained smiles and tighter hugs. But I wouldn't be excluded anymore, not because they welcomed me, but because I had learned how to exist without their permission. And I was just getting started. It is strange how quickly a shift in perception can carve new architecture within familiar spaces. The rooms I used to walk through unnoticed, the conversations I used to be conveniently left out of. Suddenly, they bent toward me, like shadows stretching at dusk. I had once been a silence in the house, a breath too soft to register. Now I was a presence impossible to overlook. Yet their smiles, the new ones, the overly bright, teeth-baring apologies wrapped in social graces, tasted of false sugar. The sweetness didn't hide the bitterness underneath. I didn't trust it. I didn't have to. The family hadn't forgiven me for not being the version of myself they preferred. The quiet, pliable ghost content to orbit the shining suns of the household without casting her own light. And I hadn't forgiven them for demanding that of me in the first place. The inheritance from Aunt Margaret hadn't changed who I was. It had changed the way they had to look at me. And nothing is more intolerable to those invested in a hierarchy than having the bottom rung refuse to stay in place. The next wave came quietly. Not through confrontation, but calculation. They began inviting me again. It started with a brunch, hosted by Celine, of course. Always the strategist, always trying to reshape the narrative before it fully escaped her control. She emailed, then followed up with a text message. I'd love to catch up, just us. I think we both said things that came out wrong. I hadn't said anything, of course. That was the quiet beauty of it. I had spoken in movement, in presence, in silence, a language they had never been fluent in. But I said yes. Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because the battlefield had shifted, and I intended to walk across it on my terms. Her condo was perched above the city like a crown, modern, excessive, decorated with art she couldn't pronounce, the kind of place meant to signal affluence, curated more for appearances than for comfort. I arrived 15 minutes late on purpose. She answered the door barefoot and over-perfumed, her smile mechanical. "You look amazing," she said, her voice tuned to the pitch of practiced warmth. "Florence suits you." "I think it's the lack of forced small talk," I replied, brushing past her into the living room. "Sunlight helps too." Her jaw twitched, but she didn't rise to the bait. She was too disciplined for that. Brunch was laid out on marble counters like a Pinterest board come to life. Croissants that had never touched a human hand, exotic fruits sliced into submission, eggs she didn't cook. There was champagne too, Veuve Clicquot, chilled to the exact temperature her online sommelier had recommended. The whole setup reeked of desperation wrapped in elegance. We talked, or rather, she tried to. I gave her short answers, watched her shift tactics with the subtlety of a chess master mid-match. She asked about Florence, about Margaret, about the bookstore. "I saw the photos from the reading event," she said, slicing into an avocado like it owed her money. "I had no idea Margaret had such connections. Who were those people?" "Friends of hers. Friends of mine now, I suppose." Celine's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. "You've always had this mysterious quality. I think people underestimate you. We probably did too." It was the first time she'd used we. Not I, not Mom, not the twins. We, the royal family of exclusion. "I think you liked me better that way," I replied, sipping the champagne. Unseen, predictable. There was no recovery from that line. Not really. She didn't try. Instead, she pivoted. "You know," she began, casually plucking a strawberry. "Mom's been going through it ever since the video. She says she didn't know what we were planning, that she thought you knew about the vacation and just weren't interested." I blinked. Once. Slowly. "You expect me to believe that?" I asked. "After years of being treated like a guest in my own bloodline, you want to pretend it was all a misunderstanding?" "I'm saying it's complicated," she insisted. "Family always is. And now, well, now things are different. You have influence. People are watching. We should be united." There it was. Not an apology. Not a request for forgiveness. A proposition. A truce offered on the condition that I step back into the fold. Not as a threat. Not as an equal. But as an accessory. A family rebrand. And I was the new face they wanted to use. I leaned back, folding one leg over the other, and looked her dead in the eye. "I'm not interested in being part of the same pattern, Celine. You want unity because it's convenient, because it looks better. But let's be honest. You liked me invisible. You all did, and now that I'm not, you don't know what to do with me." A beat passed. 2. Her expression didn't change, but her silence spoke louder than any protest. I stood, placed the untouched croissant back on the plate, and walked to the door. "Thanks for brunch," I said, glancing over my shoulder. "Next time serve honesty instead of champagne." She didn't follow me. But that wasn't the end, not even close, because the cracks were beginning to spread. A week later, I got an anonymous tip from someone I didn't know. A burner email address. No signature, no fluff. Just a subject line. "They're planning something." Attached were screenshots, messages from a new group chat. This time one that didn't include me, but very much talked about me. It was called Operation Restore Order. I read every message, Celine leading the charge, Sophie chiming in, trying to be the voice of reason, but still complicit. My mother suggesting they speak to a family lawyer. Not to contest the will, that ship had long sailed, but to re-express their concerns about how Margaret's mental state may have affected her decisions. Max, ever the opportunist, floated the idea of me setting up a family foundation where they could all benefit equally. as if my inheritance had been communal property. It was both pathetic and grotesque. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because by then, the media had caught wind of something juicier. A reporter from the Times reached out. She'd read my essays, connected the dots, and wanted to do a profile. Half about Margaret's legacy, half about how I'd gone from the forgotten daughter to the one carrying the name forward. I agreed. The piece went viral. The headline was brutal in its simplicity: the family that forgot her, and the heiress who didn't need them. The quotes were carefully chosen. I didn't slander anyone. I didn't have to. The facts did the work for me. And the facts were, they left me behind. They built a world without me. And when I dared to build my own, they came knocking with rehearsed regret. The fallout was instantaneous. My mother stopped speaking to me. Grandma had a lawyer send a letter regarding potential defamatory insinuations, which was quickly ignored. Celine posted a thinly veiled Instagram story about people who weaponize trauma for attention. And I booked a return flight to Florence. The air smelled like rain when I landed. The villa waited, timeless and sprawling, its walls heavy with books and secrets and old lives now inherited by someone who had once been disposable. I stood on the balcony that evening and looked out at the river, my glass of wine untouched on the table. I wasn't happy, not in the fairy tale sense. This wasn't some redemption arc or a final victory. Happiness was never the goal, but I was free. And more importantly, seen. They hadn't wanted to include me. That much was clear, but they'd never imagined that in pushing me away, they'd hand me the perfect angle for the story I was born to write. And the most exquisite part? They couldn't stop reading. There's a particular silence that falls over a family once its mythology begins to unravel. It's not just the absence of words. It's the suffocating presence of things unsaid. The vacuum left behind when illusions die and no one knows quite how to grieve them. It's in the way conversations skip like scratched vinyl. In the way eyes flinch from meeting yours across a room once filled with performative smiles and carefully modulated tones. And it's in the way the stories, the ones they told themselves about who was worthy and who wasn't, stop making sense. In the weeks after the article dropped, I became the ghost that haunted every one of their gatherings. Not physically. I was still in Florence, wrapped in the slow, rich hours of Mediterranean life. I spent mornings in Margaret's bookstore, running my hands across spines aged with dust and time, curating the shelves by instinct rather than trend. Afternoons in the villa, windows thrown open to the scent of lemons and jasmine, editing the manuscript I never thought I'd finish. Evenings were spent at dinner tables with people who had nothing to prove to me, writers, artists, professors, and once a woman named John, who taught philosophy like she was writing poetry in my mouth. It was a life so different from the one I'd been carved out of that sometimes I wondered if I'd dreamed the old one. But they hadn't forgotten me. They couldn't. Their friends read the article. Their colleagues commented on it over mocktails. Even Grandma's country club circle, the very people she used to parade her perfect lineage before, began to ask questions. I didn't know she had another granddaughter, the writer, the one from the papers. She inherited all that from Margaret, didn't she? Quite the coup. I always thought Celine was the ambitious one, but the other girl, what's her name? She has something. That phrase, the other girl, was a needle in their skin they couldn't remove, and it began to rot. The first true collapse came not in the form of some headline or scandal, but in something far more intimate, a family photo, or rather, its destruction. It was a picture I remembered well, taken at Celine's college graduation years ago. Everyone dressed in pastel lies and posed affection, standing in front of a columned building that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with legacy. I had been cropped out. Not metaphorically, but literally. I remembered the moment it was taken. I had stood on the far edge, holding my breath like an apology. When the framed copy appeared on Grandma's mantel, my shoulder had been sliced neatly from the edge, an invisible surgery of familial revision. But the photo didn't survive this time. Natalie texted me the image. Shards of glass, a cracked frame, the picture bent and torn down the middle. Celine and Grandma both split in half, jagged lines across their smiles. According to Natalie, it happened during a dinner. Tension snapped like a violin string. Something about reputations, about inheritance, about me. Apparently, Grandma accused Celine of failing to contain the fallout. Celine snapped back about outdated values, about favoritism. The twins stayed silent, rare for them, but Sophie reportedly left early, eyes rimmed red. Max tried to play diplomat, but was too busy networking with some investor cousin to commit. And somewhere between the soup and the second course, the frame was knocked from the mantel. Whether it was an accident or the culmination of 20 years of misdirected resentment, no one was certain. But there it was, splintered, cracked, unrecoverable. Symbolism, it seemed, had a sense of drama. The fallout rippled. More messages followed, some cautious, some confessional. Natalie again, whispering secrets through encrypted texts. She told me Grandma had begun talking about rebalancing the family structure, that there was talk of a legacy dinner being organized, an exclusive gathering of the most impactful family members to discuss future planning. My name, of course, wasn't mentioned in the early stages. They still didn't understand, still thought they could gatekeep a bloodline like a country club. I sent no reply, but I bought a plane ticket. Not to return to their doorstep. No, that chapter had closed. I had a new strategy now. Let them build their event. Let them seat themselves in a circle of delusion. Let them raise their glasses to a legacy curated by denial. I would simply publish the truth. The idea came slowly, like wine blooming on the tongue. A memoir, not of revenge, not of riches, but of erasure, of family, of the spaces between what's said and what's silenced. I had the receipts, the emails, the absence. I had the voice they never meant for me to keep. I began writing it with a kind of hunger I didn't recognize in myself. Pages poured from me, scenes I hadn't let myself remember. Birthdays skipped, awards dismissed. Quiet rooms where I waited for praise that never came. I wrote about the way Celine would whisper to boys that I was just the weird cousin. About the time my mother left me off a family event card and blamed it on the printer. About the way Grandma used to introduce me as Margaret's little project once she found out we spoke. And I wrote about Bora Bora. I described the moment I saw the photo, the way the caption burned, the way my breath caught, the ache of being excluded not by accident, but design. The coldness of realizing that a group of people who claimed love could so thoroughly orchestrate absence. When the first draft was done, I sent it to my agent. She called me that night, breathless, and said, "You're not just burning the bridge. You're excavating the river beneath it." I smiled. Good. We submitted the manuscript under a veil of secrecy. The publishers were hooked. The bidding war began within days. The advance was astronomical. The rights were optioned for a limited series by a director whose name made even the unshakable Celine gasp when she eventually found out. And I still hadn't said a word to them. But, oh, how they noticed. Celine's email came first, diplomatic, polished. She mentioned hearing rumors of a memoir. She offered her help in ensuring the family was portrayed fairly, a masterclass in soft power manipulation. I replied with a single sentence, "You had your version for years. This one's mine." A week later, I received a legal notice. Not from her, from Grandma. An attempt to preemptively block the release on grounds of privacy and defamation. The letter was 6 pages of jargon, threats, and veiled appeals to family dignity. My lawyer, a magnificent shark in Dior heels, laughed through the entire reading. "They're rattled," she said. "They have no case. Everything in your manuscript is either documented or personal memory. Let them sweat." And sweat they did, because the leaks began shortly after. Someone, I still don't know who, leaked a chapter to a literary blog. The chapter about the vacation, about the group chat, about the photo. It went viral in hours. The blog crashed from the traffic. Twitter ignited. Suddenly I was no longer just the heiress. I was the storyteller. The girl cut from the frame who had become the lens. Interviews poured in, podcasts, panels, requests for rights in 6 languages. But what mattered most was that I had written myself into permanence, into legacy, and they had no control over it. The next time I saw them was by accident. A gallery opening in New York. I had flown in for business, attended the event out of curiosity. The art was mediocre. Overpriced commentary on capitalism painted by people who had never once gone without. But the crowd was elite, humming with power. And there, by the champagne fountain, stood Celine. She was thinner. Not model thin, stress thin. Her dress was designer, her heels sharp, but the confidence she once wore like armor had dulled. She saw me before I saw her. Her spine straightened, her mouth froze mid-sentence. We locked eyes, and something in her shattered. She walked toward me, slowly, like she wasn't sure I was real. "You're here," she said. "Apparently." A beat of silence, not awkward, charged. "I read it," she admitted, barely above a whisper. "All of it." I raised an eyebrow. "And?" "You left things out." I laughed. "You should be grateful for that." She didn't smile, just looked at me like I'd become something she couldn't classify. A stranger wearing the face of the family she thought she understood. "You made us villains." "No," I said. "You just never thought someone else would get to write the story." She opened her mouth, but I turned away before she could finish. She didn't follow. Not this time. That night, I stood in front of my hotel window, New York shimmering below, and realized something that settled into my bones like a final note in a symphony. They hadn't excluded me from the vacation because they hated me. They excluded me because they needed someone to exclude. They needed a scapegoat, a margin to scribble their insecurities into. And I had let them, for too long. But not anymore. The memoir released a month later. It debuted at #1. The dedication read, "To those who closed the door. Thank you for teaching me how to build my own." You could hear it now. The echo. It rang through every corridor of the once untouchable Wright family legacy like a slow leak in a mansion's foundation. You wouldn't notice it if you weren't listening. That's how all collapses start. Not with a bang, but with a creaking shift. Something subtle, internal, irreversible. The memoir hadn't just made waves. It had reshaped the landscape entirely. People began to recognize me in public. Not in the pop star, fangirl scream way, but in the quiet, hesitant glance that carried both admiration and a certain pity. Not because they saw me as broken, no. That would have been their old view. Now they saw someone who had survived a narrative so many of them understood too well. The forgotten. The overlooked. The misnamed. Readers wrote to me in swells. Daughters erased by fathers. Sons discarded by mothers. Siblings who had been told they were just too sensitive, too different, too much, or never enough. And my name, once a whispered footnote in Wright family gatherings, now lingered on the covers of magazines and review columns. There were interviews, standing ovations, even an award shortlist. I'd become what they had spent years making sure I'd never be, impossible to ignore. But success is never just a rise. It's a reckoning. And mine was circling back. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because those who once held the upper hand couldn't stand the sight of their throne crumbling beneath them. The family, as expected, fractured. My cousin Natalie, the silent observer who'd long straddled the line between complicity and kindness, finally jumped ship. She emailed me one night with the kind of message that begins carefully but quickly spirals into the kind of raw truth you only write at 2 a.m. "I read your book 3 times, once out of curiosity, once in denial, and once because I needed to believe someone else had seen what I saw. You didn't lie. You didn't even exaggerate. You were gentle with people who didn't deserve your mercy. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I see you now. I always did. I just wasn't brave enough to say it when it counted." It wasn't an apology I needed, but it was one I received without resistance. Others weren't so elegant. Celine went on the offensive. She started by crafting a sanitized counter-narrative, a glossy podcast interview with one of her PR-obsessed friends, where she described our family dynamic as complex but loving, where she framed the exclusion as a misunderstanding exaggerated by emotion and distance. She never used my name. Just her. That was the first attempt. The second was worse. An op-ed, penned under the guise of restoring dignity, landed on a popular media outlet. It was a masterstroke of victim playing, recounting how being in the spotlight had affected her mental health, how watching a loved one distort the truth for attention was heartbreaking, how some stories aren't meant to be monetized. Again, no direct names, but the implication was nuclear. My editor asked if I wanted to respond. I didn't. Not with another book, or a social post, or a carefully worded legal threat. I had written my truth. They were scrambling to catch up. I wasn't going to validate their rebranding campaign with another act in their play. But that didn't mean I wouldn't move the pieces. Instead of answering Celine's rebuttal, I accepted an invitation that sent ripples through their entire ecosystem. I agreed to speak at a university where Grandma was once on the board of trustees, a prestigious old-money institution where the right name was engraved on one of the lecture halls. Not because of merit, never that, but because years ago someone in the family had written a very generous check. The event was titled, Narrative Power, Reclaiming Voice in the Face of Erasure. There were whispers before I even arrived. I knew they'd be there. Not all of them, of course. My mother had gone completely silent, retreating to whatever wine-soaked suburban cave she used to pretend the world wasn't happening. Max had posted vague TikToks about not letting the haters get to you while trying to launch a podcast about crypto investing. But Celine would come. And she did. She took a seat in the third row, perfectly visible. Dressed in power beige, her jaw tight, her fingers twitching with restraint. I could almost hear the thoughts turning in her head, the script she was rewriting for herself with each passing second. The room was full. Students, faculty, journalists, readers, strangers who had only heard whispers of the story. I stood behind the podium, looked out at them, and didn't feel fear. Not even a flutter. Just precision. I grew up thinking silence was safer than truth, I began. That if I just kept my head down, stayed out of the way, the people around me would eventually make space for me. That day never came, so I made my own space. I spoke for 40 minutes, not from notes, not from prepared remarks, just memory, lived truth. I talked about how being excluded wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was the quiet that carved deepest. I told them about how families curate themselves, editing out the inconvenient characters. I told them about Margaret, about how one woman choosing to see me had rewired my entire future, about how legacy isn't something you inherit, it's something you decide to become. When I finished, the applause wasn't polite. It was thunder. Celine didn't clap, but she didn't walk out either. Afterward, she approached. Her eyes were dark-ringed, not from makeup, from sleeplessness. "You're winning," she said softly. "Do you even care what it's doing to the rest of us?" I tilted my head. "You mean the part where you all built a world that didn't need me, and now that I've built one without you, you're upset I'm not letting you curate it?" She blinked, wounded. But I didn't stop. I cared, for years. I bled for scraps of acknowledgement. I begged for a place at your table. And you handed me indifference dressed as discipline. Now you're choking on the narrative you never expected me to write. Her face tightened. "We were trying to protect the family." "No, you were protecting the hierarchy." There was nothing else to say. She walked away, and I walked forward.